The continuing leadership instability at the Public Investment Corporation has received public scrutiny. Africa's biggest assets management firm has for many weeks faced turmoil, with the Chief Executive Officer, Patrick Dlamini, being placed on precautionary suspension and the Financial Sector Conduct Authority instituting an inquiry. Now, earlier this week, 4 non-executive board members also resigned, bringing the number to 6 directors who have recently resigned. The PIC is a wholly owned government institution and oversees more than 3 trillion rand in assets, including investments and public servants' pensions. To talk more about the developments at the PIC, we are joined by Chartered Accountant and Director at Corusca Consulting, and that, of course, is Khaya Sithole. So nice to see you, Khaya. Thanks for your time.
Thank you and good morning.
It's a mess. What is going on at the PIC?
Well, it's difficult to know where to start, but perhaps the summary is simply that it is a governance crisis and it is a leadership crisis. And core to the issues is the simple question of where the lines of authority are to be drawn. And in this instance, you do have, unfortunately, a complicated model in which you could say there are 4 centers of authority, which I'm going to explain now. The first one is, of course, the board of directors themselves, who are appointed in terms of the PIC Act. And then you've got the executives who are supposed to be running the day-to-day activities of the PIC. But also, quite importantly, you've got the minister, which is the national treasurer, which is a shareholder. And then you've got the government employees pension fund, which is the primary client of the PIC. Now, wherever you look, the question of who's responsible for what and where the boundaries of authorities lie tends to be a bit blurry, particularly in terms of crisis. And this is yet another manifestation of that, where it's unclear who's responsible for what, who's accountable for what. And in the absence of that sense of clarity, you do find the hysteria and the chaos that we're seeing here now being repeated once again.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's a great summary and a good word, the hysteria, I should say. So let's now look at what's happened subsequently to all of this. The Deputy Finance Minister and the PIC Chairperson, David Masondo, has announced a decision to actually refer the assets management firm to the Special Investigating Unit. When did this all start going wrong for the PIC? Because this certainly didn't happen overnight.
Well, in relation to the SIU investigation, you're actually speaking about a specific transaction. And this is a transaction that started as far back as 2013, and it's a simple question of how Lanseria was acquired. So what happened is that naturally somebody would have come to the PIC and say, look, there's a deal that's pending, I'd like to participate in it, and I'd like you guys to finance me for it. And that's what Acapulco essentially did. So naturally, the PIC then advances money to Acapulco so that Acapulco can buy its share of the transaction. Now, the expectation is that obviously the loan was going to be repaid. And when the loan was not repaid, then there is a clause that said, well, we as a PIC can then take over the shares that we enabled you to buy. And at that point in time, obviously, there'll be a question of, well, how much do you owe us at the point in time that you decide to activate on this clause? And depending on what you owe us versus the value of what the shares are going to be, then that ought to form the basis of the settlement. Now, when that materializes, the only thing that everybody agrees on is the fact that Acapulco owed the PIC 600 million rand. Every other part is a matter of dispute. And central to the dispute is the question of, well, if the PIC is only owed 600 million rand, what is the value of the shares that it's going to get as part of the settlement? If the value of the shares is below 600 million rand, it means that the PIC will be out of money, it will still be owed. If the value of the shares is more than 600 million rand, it would mean that the PIC takes over the shares and then pays the difference between the value of the shares and the value of the outstanding loan out to Acapulco. And that's where the question of the value of the shares becomes central to the dispute. Now, when you have a number that says that the value of the shares is worth R1 billion, it means that the PIC must pay out Acapulco 400 million. If any other number basically comes up beyond 600 million rand, it means there's a payout after that. So that is a transaction that then gets finalized in one way or another. What unfortunately then happens is that the CEO of the PIC then, after that process, initiates an inquiry that PwC runs that says, wait, hold on, how did it come to be that an entity that owed us 600 million rand ended up getting another 400 million rand in order for us to settle this transaction? Can you look into how exactly all of these calculations were determined? And that is the center of the dispute relating to the CEO, because now it turns out that there is a difference of opinion over whether the CEO had the authority to even ask PwC to do anything beyond the question of the payment. And in instances where the CEO did not get the right authority to do so, then some members of the board say that's a basis for a suspension. So that's what then leads to the suspension of the CEO. At least that's just one of the issues that leads to the suspension of the CEO. So the Deputy Finance Minister then says, in relation to that particular transaction, I also would like the SIU to look into what really happened, because it doesn't look like we are reaching a meeting of the minds, or the understanding across the boardroom and across the stakeholders is not the same about really what this transaction was about. So that's where the SIU angle comes in. It's only on that specific transaction, at least so far, that's all they've been asked to probe.
So, I mean, my concern is, and we can get into all of the nitty-gritty, and I mean, just what you said. As you said, this is one reason, and there could be many, many more reasons that has led to the PIC Chief Executive Patrick Dlamini being placed on precautionary suspension. Who's currently making decisions? Because that is the major problem here. I mean, this is a PIC that is overseeing more than 3 trillion rand in assets. Who's running this?
Well, you start off by saying that at the executive level, you have the CEO, you've got the Chief Investment Officer, and then you've got the Chief Financial Officer. At least that's what you're supposed to have. If you walk to mainland today, you're only going to find one of those individuals, and that's the CFO, who's now acting as a CEO. What happened is that the Chief Investment Officer left the organization earlier, and then the Chief Executive Officer has been suspended. The consequence of those is that the PIC's business is the business of investing money and ensuring that the pension assets that has been given by its clients are grown. In other words, decisions have to be made on what to invest and where to invest and who is going to manage those investments. So when you then have those critical decision makers not being in office, there is a paralysis in decision making, which means that ultimately many deals that are pending or many decisions that are meant to be made are going to be delayed or deferred. Now, even when there are people that are within the organization that are acting, you can imagine what tends to happen when there's a bigger crisis out there. Nobody wants to make a decision in time of a crisis, because you do not know what ultimately is going to prevail as the real state of the organization thereafter. So even individuals who are there are not going to be suddenly accelerating their deal-making activity or their decision-making activity, because they kind of do not know where they stand within the organization or where the organization itself stands. So that is the most acute consequence of what you see when there's a governance paralysis of this nature.
Yeah, that is a great concern. I mean, as you say, the government pension fund is the biggest investor in that. But I want to ask you about this now. There are also questions about the fund's unlisted portfolio. I mean, the PIC has investments in, I think, 150 unlisted companies, and of which 39 legacy investments are undergoing turnaround or distress management processes. I imagine there are big concerns around this, and the public has concern regarding this.
Well, the problem that happens with the PIC is that if the PIC invests in a listed company or in a listed share, it's kind of easy for everybody to understand what the value of that investment ought to be, because the information is publicly available. You can have as many asset managers or market participants looking at it and say, yes, the value is 100 Rand. So obviously, if the PIC then decides to pay 300 Rand in relation to that share, everybody will say, wait, hold on. Every single market participant says the value is 100 Rand, so how are you paying 300 Rand? So it's much easier to manage investments in the listed space, because there's some element of market transparency. That means that you're not going to end up with someone saying significantly overpaying for an asset. On the unlisted space, however, this is where the question of judgment calls. This is where the question of discretion comes in. Because ultimately, what will happen is that there is a private company that somebody says we think is worth an investment case. Somebody presents an investment case, and then ultimately the question is, well, what is the value of this investment? And people may then come up with different numbers, but ultimately a decision has to be made. So the question that then emerges is, what happens if the decision is made on the wrong business fundamentals, or completely the valuation is incorrect on many dimensions? And that's where the PIC tends to find itself get trapped. So in the Isbaya fund, that's where you have the unlisted investments. And naturally, on an average basis, it is impossible for every single investment in a fund of that nature to be performing perfectly throughout. So there's always going to be those poor investments that, at the point in time when an investment decision was made, we thought this is what the market was going to look like. It turns out that we were wrong. And ironically, Lanseria is a good case study of that, because obviously in 2013, if somebody said to you, this is what the aviation sector looks like in South Africa, this is what the projections are for tourism and for human mobility, somebody would have said, these are the fundamentals that ultimately lead us to saying we think Lanseria is worth investing in. And then COVID happens, then suddenly the aviation sector is very different. And then Kulula collapses, for example, then the aviation sector is very different. So naturally, all the fundamentals that you'd have had at the point of making the investment decision have been interrupted and sometimes decimated by exogenous factors. Now, for a transaction of this nature, the PIC's responsibility is to simply explain that, look, the fundamentals that we looked at when the deal was conceptualized were as follows. These are the exogenous or the extraordinary factors that interrupted that, so therefore we understand why this investment is underperforming. That's really what an investment manager is meant to do.
Yeah.
But with the PIC, it turns out that the accusation, at least, is that far too many of the decisions in the unlisted space are not going to stand up to scrutiny. So if you ask them, well, what was the basis for investing in this one? What was the basis for choosing these counterparties? Then the questions are not as fluid, or at least the questions are not as transparent as you like them to be. So that's where people have then said, well, actually, it looks like in this Spire fund, that's where the malfeasance happens. And the simple answer is that it's the judgment calls that are made by people at the point in time an investment has to be made. And it's a simple question of whether those judgments stand the test of time. And sometimes they clearly don't.
It's hard because we're sitting and we're talking about this, and this is not the first time that the PIC has been under immense scrutiny. I mean, let's just go back to the Mpati Commission. Pretty much so the same things were under the spotlight then. And the findings from the commission, which were, I mean, there were delay after delay to try and get the finalized findings into it. And then eventually in 2020, it was released. And it was found that there's improper investment decisions, conflicts of interest, political interference, governance failures, weak board oversight, personal enrichment by some executives as investment partners. There seems to be a lot of repetition here. What came out of this Mpati Commission? And I mean, are we seeing a repeat of history? Has anything changed since this commission?
Well, two key outcomes from the Mpati Commission relate to the governance and the operations. Those are I think, the most important outcomes from them. On the operational side, what had happened within the PIC is that at some point in time, the Chief Executive Officer, as it was then, decided that, well, the other very important job in the PIC is the investment job, which is the Chief Investment Officer job. So then those two roles have been collapsed into one, which simply meant that there wasn't a delineation of authority between the executive officer and the investment officer. So the Mpati Commission said that, look, before we've had a model where the roles were separate, where the lines of authority were very clear. When the role was combined, it made it a bit difficult to sort of know where the boundaries of authority were. So the Mpati Commission simply says you must revert back to the model of the CEO being a standalone individual and the CIO, the investment officer, being a standalone individual. And that was a recommendation that was largely accepted, and then it was implemented. On the governance side, however, the issue that the Mpati Commission took exception to is the fact that the PIC Act prescribes who ought to be on the board of the PIC. So you've got the Deputy Minister of Finance currently being the chairperson of the board, and even the rest of the roles that other 10 non-executive directors are essentially deployed in one way or another. So the unions, the GEPF, and all the other stakeholders have the ability to then deploy someone into the board. So immediately what that does is that it denies the PIC an opportunity to go out into the market and find the best skills that are available in relation to the type of organization it either is or it seeks to be. So because you are now having to work with this limited canvas, it simply is an institution that isn't given the opportunity to tap into the best skills that are out there in the market.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that the members of the board are not good at their job. For as long as those institutions, whether it's the GPF or National Treasury, are themselves able to then go out onto the market and then say, we're going to find the best people that we can deploy, then the model could work. But unfortunately, at this stage, you end up with the model where more questions get asked about, well, what is the big idea around how this institution should be governed? Do these institutions that then deploy individuals to sit on this board have at least that understanding that you have to go out there and find the best skills in the market and then still deploy them to then obviously serve as your representatives onto the board? If you get that right, then the PIC has a chance. I don't think we're going to get into a model where the politicians are willing to let this go. It's simply far too late. It's been tried. The Party Commission made recommendations, and the politicians and the NC government in particular simply ignored those part of the recommendations.
I mean, you look at the chairperson, and I'd love to get your views on this. I mean, you've got the chairperson who's the Deputy Minister of Finance, David Masondo. So, I mean, if you have a look at that, would you say that the dual role, does it strengthen accountability or create that additional governance complexity?
Well, it's definitely a complexity because, again, as I said, it may well turn out that the best person to chair a board of the PIC at a particular point in time is someone who's not even a politician. But for as long as the law says it must be a politician, then you've limited the canvas. The canvas is actually even more limited in the case that the law says that the person who chairs the PIC must be a deputy minister, not from National Treasury, but from the economic cluster. So obviously now you're talking about questions of a person like John Steenhuisen, for example, who's a deputy minister in the economic cluster because he's now a DTIC. You're talking about just a limited group of people who can then be approached in order to run this job. Again, it may well turn out that even within government, even within cabinet, there are people that are much more fit for this job, but because they do not fall within the definition of the economic cluster, then they cannot be asked to do the job. So those are the limitations that have been created. And again, if it was a more open process, if it was a more robust process where you are simply saying we're trying to find the best person available and the best person who is capable, then it would strengthen the PIC. I don't think anyone's going to argue that a narrow canvas is more useful than a wider canvas.
Absolutely. We're running into time constraints. I'm fully aware of it. But one thing we haven't spoken about is the issue of whistleblowers. And it certainly does appear that the entire crisis began with whistleblower disclosures. Does this suggest that the internal mechanisms don't work at the PIC, that the governance systems have actually failed here?
Well, the thing about whistleblower channels is that whistleblower channels should be indeed the type of mechanism that enables people to say, here's an issue that has been raised. These are the channels in which it's going to get interrogated. So if somebody says that there's a whistleblower complaint against a CEO, for example, it should be quite clear that obviously only the board can oversee that because you don't want the CEO who presides over the entire organization trying to get his own subordinates to judge on him. It simply doesn't work. So the whistleblower mechanisms are meant to work. The problem here is that when whistleblower channels are then abused, or rather there is a lack of transparency about how whistleblower complaints are then managed, then you end up with this particular crisis because at this point in time, not even the board of the PIC has come out and said, look, the substance of the whistleblower allegations are this. This is the primary channel in which they're vetted, whether it's an internal audit or whether it's the audit and risk committee. And these are the ones that we think as a case to answer, and therefore this was activated. In other words, if there was clarity around what happens to whistleblower complaints, then everybody would know that, look, under these particular parameters, then a suspension of a CEO is warranted. Under these particular parameters, then a recusal of a board member is warranted if a whistleblower complaint has these particular merits. You do not want to run the risk of me being an aggrieved person who has found myself on the wrong side of a transaction with the PIC, suddenly abusing this whistleblower channel to simply then cast aspersions with the understanding that the PIC will press the panic button and say, there's been a whistleblower complaint, so therefore, until we know otherwise, we're going to suspend you. That will simply mean it's an organization that is going to be chaotic. And you can imagine how many people are aggrieved about the PIC's processes, either because they haven't found joy with their investment thesis or for some other reason. You cannot run the risk of the whistleblower process being used as a tool to simply paralyze the institution.
I want to wrap this up, but I don't want to leave it on a low note because there's a lot of money involved here and there are a lot of people that depend on these pensions and this money. Obviously, what we're looking at is governance failures, not investment failures. Does everything still look good in terms of investments at the PIC?
Well, in the short run, the litmus test for that is what we call the solvency assessment that the GPF in particular has to do. And what that solvency assessment has to ask is the question of, well, if for some reason or the other, every single pensioner that we have an obligation to, if they had to demand their money tomorrow, are there enough assets to honor those obligations? So that simply means, are the assets that the PIC is managing on our behalf sufficient to honor the obligations that we have towards our pensioners? And in instances where the answer is yes, then all is good to go. The problem emanates in the long run in that if the PIC does indeed make bad investment decisions and suddenly starts losing money, then you have to keep asking the question of, well, are the assets under management still sufficient to meet the liabilities of the pensioners as they were? That's a simple answer.
Yeah.
The more difficult one is that if the answer is no, in other words, if it turns out that the PIC has squandered some of these funds and suddenly the liabilities of the GEPF exceed the assets that are back those liabilities, unfortunately, you and I then have to step in because it is a defined benefit fund. In other words, the pensioners are guaranteed a particular number. And if it turns out that there isn't sufficient assets to honor that number that's been guaranteed, you and I as a taxpayer are actually responsible for the difference. So we'd have to top up. So that's why it matters to you and I whether the PIC is well governed or not.
Khaya, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Khaya Sithole, of course, giving us his views and unpacking what's happening at the PIC.